colonial, like, that's a colonial product. And when I refer to blood quantum, it's a concept that has been used by governments in both Canada and the United States around defining who is considered quote unquote Indian or Indigenous enough to be legally recognized as Indigenous, and the benefits that come along with that. Not that those benefits are not definitely enough for all the atrocities that have been committed to our peoples, but there's it's a very, especially in Canada, I can't really speak as much to the United States, but in Canada, the process of applying for status and getting status is purposely very difficult, time consuming, and purposely made to be very complicated to deter Indigenous people from claiming their rights as being, the first peoples here, right? So I just wanted to just touch on that a bit. I feel like that's important. But obviously, things like status just really contributes to essentially the legalized cultural genocide of our people, of Indigenous peoples. It's just on paper instead of physically. So that being said, I'm now going to talk a bit more about challenges that I faced growing up while being an urban Indigenous person, while being a mixed Indigenous person, and being disabled. So this is my own personal experience. It doesn't necessarily apply to every Indigenous person, but there are a lot of commonalities, I believe. And so I found my biggest challenges that I was thinking of prior to doing this talk, when I first got these questions, are primarily in healthcare and education growing up. So, oh gosh, I'm really thirsty. Just give me a moment. So, the healthcare section is specifically in regards to my disabilities. So first off, I am on the autism spectrum, but I didn't get diagnosed until I was, let's see, how old was I? I was about 20, and I'm, well, going to be 23 on Sunday. I can't say I'm 23 now because that's not quite true. Point is, I suspect that a lot of the reasons, and this is a lot of people who are either assigned or are children of color or both, is that there's often a racial and gender bias that came and still comes along in regards to an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And so I think the biggest impact for me was that cultural differences between my family and how I interacted with family members and just navigated the world was very different to how doctors and professionals diagnosed autism, because typically autism spectrum diagnoses are given, professional diagnoses are given to little white boys, right? And usually don't see somebody like me from a very young age getting an autism diagnosis, even though when I was much younger, it was a lot more, I suppose, obvious that I was autistic. But the main issue, or the main reason why they didn't say I was diagnosed with it at the time, was because I liked physical contact from my family. And I never really thought about it until recently, but I think that actually is a big cultural thing. But that was the main reason I ended up not getting diagnosed, because typically, according to their diagnosis, or their diagnosis criteria, is that all autistic people absolutely hate physical touch, even though this was before autism was defined as a spectrum, though. This was like about 20 years ago. So it's different, somewhat different now, but it's still not very common for Indigenous children and Black children in particular, let alone girls or people who are assigned a female birth to have a professional autism spectrum diagnosis. And I'm thankful that I was able to get some supports because I didn't live on reserve and I lived in an urban center like Hamilton. Otherwise, my experiences may have been even more different. But because I didn't have that professional diagnosis of being autistic enough, I end up not being able to get a lot of supports, in the public education system. So that also impacted, that impacted my ability to do well academically and get a proper education that I didn't only need but also deserved, just like any other child. And then another example of that is that I'm also chronically ill. I've been living with arthritis and fibromyalgia for the last 6 years. It took 4 to get diagnosed, and a lot of that was because of my own fatness, like because I use fat not necessarily in a bad way, but just as a descriptor, in a way to reclaim that word, to not necessarily be inherently like a bad word. And so I was often blamed because of my weight that I had these illnesses. So I got told for years by doctors to, oh, just lose weight and then come back and see if that does anything. And so I was denied healthcare that I desperately needed for years, and forced to live in pain and suffering simply because of my fatness. But the point is that the concept of fatness is ultimately linked to indigeneity and Blackness because, sorry, just blanking out for a sec. The origins of the idea of, the ideas of fat phobia link back to specific features that often a lot of Indigenous and Black people had back then, but still now, that are inherent features of our ethnicities. And so that just goes to show how much white supremacy there is in the medical system, and how many often, people of color, but Indigenous and Black people in particular, and Indigenous and Black disabled people, their health concerns and conditions are not taken seriously, or they do not know how to properly treat them because white fin bodies have been the ones that have only ever been studied. And I found a lot of my other challenges growing up as well involved education. I found there were a lot of, when I was growing up, there were a lot of issues between teachers and the schools that I went to and my parents because of us being an interracial / mixed race family. My siblings and I all have different skin tones. My sister's paler than I am. My brother's darker than I am. I'm kind of in between. And so often when it was either my mom or my dad picking this up, if the teachers at the school didn't know, because we didn't have, we weren't able to get busing. It's a long story. It was either them picking us up, they'd often get confused because they wouldn't think that that was our parent. And then there's a specific example that I'm going to share. It's a story about my twin brother. So he was, when we were in kindergarten, he, at that age, he had something that's a common kind of birthmark in children with Black ancestry or who are Black called, but the way it often looks like bruising, and it's very big and it's like across his whole back. It often looks like it could be symptoms of child abuse. And so my teacher at the time, basically brought my parents in and questioned them about that. And my mom had to explain about what that birthmark was on my brother's back. It's not something I had, but he did. And so I think that goes to show that, especially because these were, pretty sure he was a white teacher too. that just assumed that because of this birthmark that my brother had on his back that he was being abused. And then also because he was definitely perceived as a child of color, that just adds another whole layer of racism on top of it. And this isn't something I tell many people either, not that last story, but this one. So I repeated first grade. I had, as part of my autism, I had a severe developmental delay, and that caused me to need to repeat a grade because they had to spend so much time focusing on my language skills. And the principal and I guess my teacher at the time met with my parents. And as far as I know, I don't remember because I was like 6 years old at the time, but my dad was obviously, he was upset about it. My parents were, which is understandable to an extent. And he was perceived as being threatening towards this white principal. And so we're in the public board. And after that incident, even though he didn't actually do anything threatening or violent, he was no longer allowed to be on school property for any of the schools within the public school board. And that followed us until all of us graduated from high school in the public board, which is pretty messed up. I mean, my dad wasn't around that much anyway, so it didn't cause that big of an issue. But either way, the fact that it likely had to do with him being Indigenous and being an Indigenous man, and assuming that he's going to be violent is really messed up. And aside from those specific examples, I have just more generalized ones. I was very much bullied when I was in school for having racialized features. Like I had, especially when I was younger, had like really kinky hair. For being neurodivergent, it was pretty obvious that I was. So those two identities of mine were very much intersecting in being accepted by my peers who were primarily white, neurotypical, able. Didn't very much see myself represented in education at all, especially in regards to history courses. Indigenous topics are rarely talked about, and when they are, it's often it's often not the reality of how things really work. Because obviously, it wasn't Indigenous people who wrote those history courses or those textbooks, and then there's no Black history mentioned at all. And I remember wanting to take an American history course in my high school so bad, but I didn't have room for it, just so we could talk about the civil rights movement. And I was thankful that they offered that course, but if it weren't for that, like, I would have basically have gotten, nothing knowledge about my own family and my own people in the context of Canada. And aside from that, my experience from educators was generally being treated very poorly for being disabled. I was often punished by teachers and denied resources that I needed. And honestly, that didn't stay just in grade school. I had a very similar experience when I went to university. Accessing accessibility accommodations was very challenging for similar reasons. And even in my own program that's, my own major that's considered a progressive program, I was often still tokenized and expected to do emotional labor on my various intersecting marginalized identities for students and even sometimes profs. So I found that, to get the resources and the things that I've need to be able to survive and live a decent quality of life has been incredibly challenging. And I've had to do a lot of self-advocacy over the years, and that still hasn't changed very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for just sort of explaining the challenges that you've been facing and just like the commonality of the lack of support in all avenues of institutions that you've been in, which is really unfortunate. I wanted to kind of relate this because like it's known that European contact has brought disharmony into the balance of like Indigenous health. So like you talked a little bit how you've noticed this in your life, but how have you noticed this in the work that you've like currently been doing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely connections to that as well. In terms to kind of summarize what it's been like in my personal life, there very much has been generational trauma, mental illness, physical health issues that affected most of my family, and myself included. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with historical trauma from colonization, because trauma. No, I'm not a science person, but the way trauma works, it often like physically changes your DNA, and that's obviously in intergenerational trauma for residential schools is a huge one. Not just and this isn't just me, like even though this is in my personal life, this definitely applies to a lot of the Indigenous peoples that I work with through my role as an Indigenous mental health provider. So I do primarily peer support work. So what that looks like is that I was specifically chosen for this role to do uh, one-on-one counseling work, group programming, and community outreach because I have lived experience of mental health and trauma, and also have a background in counseling. And specifically because I'm Indigenous, I work at an Indigenous Health Centre in the city. And from what I've noticed, there's incredibly long wait lists for mental health supports and for doctors, even psychiatrists. There's just not enough, there's so much need and just not enough resources that are being provided um, to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. And I'm sure this is not a huge surprise to some people, but the people that I've worked with and the community that I work with through my role being an Indigenous mental health advocate and counselor and as somebody who experiences mental illness, our community faces very high rates of chronic illnesses and physical disabilities. That's very common. And there often isn't enough support for not just the, managing symptoms and physical well-being of Indigenous peoples who have physical disabilities and chronic illnesses, but even the mental, the spiritual, and the emotional well-being of those individuals. FASD, which is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, is quite prevalent in our community. Very high amounts of housing precarity, especially homelessness, and not just individuals that are homeless, but often families of very young children. Interpersonal violence, domestic violence, very high. Mental illness is very high, especially complex PTSD. That's very common in our communities. High unemployment rates. Many of us are on social assistance, either OW, which is Ontario Works, or ODSP, to survive poverty. There's an overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system in the province and in the country as a whole, Black children as well. And also this applies to the prison system. And all of these things obviously impact Indigenous peoples to quite an extent, but even disabled Indigenous people even more. And there's quite a high percentage of Indigenous people in the community who are also disabled in some kind of way. And I would say that, there's an epidemic in our communities across the country. We just don't have, because of the consequences of colonialism and the issues that we are facing now, we just don't have the kinds of resources, supports that we need to heal from all those things and to make our community stronger and healthier.
So yeah, thank you for just explaining that, we need more people in the community to be able to understand and respect all these health issues that have been perpetrated by colonial violence that has just caused so much disparities and just disharmony with Indigenous health. Do you find that there's a difference by not having status, and do you think that has affected your personal healthcare journey?
Definitely. Obviously, I can't speak to those who do have status, but I can speak to my own experiences of being non-status. And I think it's important to note, while I'm mixed race, and that's primarily why I don't have status, there's a lot of Indigenous peoples who aren't very mixed like I am because of the legislation that's been brought into the Canadian, the legislation that has been created by the Canadian government that makes status incredibly complicated and also very easy to lose within 2 generations. This is known as essentially the 2-generation cutoff. So if you're interested in learning more about that, like I would search up that term on Google. There's a lot more information on just how complicated status is and how there's very much the reason why it's complicated and not many Indigenous peoples have it and are therefore not legally recognized by the government as Indigenous is it's like that for a reason. That's not just a coincidence. And so in terms of how this has impacted my own healthcare journey, the main, or I guess the biggest part of having status is having some kind of healthcare benefits beyond OHIP, which is basically, if you're not familiar with, is Ontario's like kind of free healthcare plan, but it covers hospital visits and doctor's visits, but it doesn't cover medications, it doesn't cover dental care, and it doesn't cover eye care. And so most people who don't have benefits with their jobs, so like my mom, for example, was a single low-income parent, working poor, she could only access minimum wage jobs, and even the ones that were full-time often did not include benefits. And so I basically didn't really have benefits until I became a full-time university student. And so not having status very much impacted my ability to get the healthcare that I needed. So like an example, 4 years until my eyesight got so bad that I absolutely needed them really bad. And that's why I'm still wearing them now after like 5 or 6 years, even though I only have an astigmatism. And we had to save up just to get the cheapest frames possible. And I still remember that. I was also, I had my own number of health issues growing up as well, in addition to, getting an autism spectrum, or attempting to get an autism spectrum diagnosis. I was hospitalized at 12 for an extended stay. I had like a life-threatening infection in my leg. And, I still didn't know how to swallow pills. But the liquid medication for the antibiotics once I left the hospital was too expensive. We couldn't afford it and we had no benefits. So I basically had to force myself to learn how to take them so we could just afford my meds after I was discharged from the hospital. But I was fortunate that even then, like the pills were quite expensive, but I was fortunate that I didn't have bad gag reflex issues like my siblings both did. In addition to this, I had a weakened immune system from a young age, and I often had infections and needed medication, but we often, because we were so poor, often had to, give up one thing to have the money for the medication. So as a result of this, we often end up having to go to food banks because we had to use the money for food to be able to afford a medication. And being a disabled young adult, like I didn't start helping my chronic illnesses till I was about like 17, and my mental illnesses as well, but I could only afford my expensive medication because OHIP Plus came into effect when I was about 20 or 21, and I had some coverage being a full-time university student before then. And I remember like I was considered taking a medical leave for a semester from university because my health issues were getting pretty bad, but I wouldn't have been able to afford my medication. This was before OHIP Plus, afford my medication without being in school full time. And even I still remember there's this one time I had a $20 copay for a regular prescription that I needed for a medication. This was only maybe a year or two ago that I needed, but I was so broke that month that I couldn't even afford a copay for a medication that I needed to basically survive. And so I guess to summarize that, being non-status has greatly impacted my ability to have my healthcare needs met. And for obviously because there's very much a direct link between all kinds of health issues that in the Indigenous community that Indigenous peoples are facing that are generational health issues because of colonialism. Yet I wasn't considered Indigenous enough by the government So I wasn't afforded benefits that my family greatly needed in order to, for me to have a decent quality of life. And that's not just my family, that's just a very common experience because most Indigenous peoples are low income or are single parents. That's just our reality. All the systems and structures are broken.
Yeah, it's
ultimately
the institutional structures of it all is like basically made to attack Indigenous and people of color in our system. So it makes it very difficult to get out of this hole that we're basically pushed down into. So based on that, in your perspective, like how do you foster a community that centers disability justice? Like how would you shape your community around you, or even just the community of Ontario, to sort of start caring and making actions and advocating for the disability justice that like is obviously needed?
Gosh, that's such a great question. Systemic change is slow and not easy, but the change that we need for Indigenous people, for people of color, for Black people, for disabled people, for all marginalized people, really it needs to start at the grassroots level. It starts here by having these kinds of conversations and dialogues. That's really the first step. Educating people so that they're aware of all these issues, because a lot of people aren't, and so therefore they don't realize what's going on, or if they do, it's like, well, it doesn't really affect me, so why should I care? But the reality is that it affects a lot more people than we think. And I kind of touched that a bit in the very first question, is that issues impacting Indigenous people, ultimately where they stem from, which arguably would be colonialism, impacts us all now as well. That's still ongoing, even if it impacts Indigenous peoples the most. The high amount of surveillance by the Ontario government and the Canadian government was created because of colonialism. And so in terms of surveillance, I'm meaning healthcare, education, people who are on EI, so like employment insurance, Ontario Works, ODSP, the list really goes on. So I suppose aside from that, I think the important thing when we're doing this kind of work is to, when we're having these kind of dialogues, for example, like if you're creating an event like this, obviously by design and by nature already built into the event so that we don't have to like, okay, how can we accommodate? For example, having an ASL interpreter like we do right now. That's just one small way. And I think meeting people where they're at and trying to reduce the amount of barriers, not just in terms of disabilities, but all kinds of different barriers that people may have in order to be able to participate in disability justice is essential to doing this work. I mean, obviously, like if that's not enough, then trying to provide accommodations where they're needed and asking really, how can I support you, is the biggest thing. And that's something I use in my work all the time, because I'm, only the expert of my own experience. And so I'm not going to know, obviously, what somebody else needs, even if we have similar experiences. So that's kind of where it's simple, but that's where I start. And I think over time, all those things build up, and then we're able to really do the work, to do that systemic change. But if we can't even have our most basic needs met, then it's not possible to do that work. And we need people at all levels. We need people on the ground doing the frontline stuff, and helping people with basic needs and making sure they're able to survive. And we need people like me, like who do counseling and that kind of thing. Like just people like me who need to be there, who I'm actually like I'm actively serving my own community and having people like Indigenous peoples in those roles, for example, in supporting Indigenous community And then obviously we need people like DJNO who are doing the advocacy, you know, at the systemic level to make the changes that all disabled people need and all marginalized people need. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's all about getting together and actually having these conversations and hearing voices. Like, obviously you don't speak for every Indigenous person with a disability, but you know, you do give people a perspective of like what it's like and how you've had to experience that throughout your whole life. And for that, I do appreciate you for coming in and speaking to me and just to everyone here. You made some very good points. So what are ways that, you know, a non-Indigenous or a white disabled person could get involved in this allyship?
I think I've touched a lot on this already, but I'm happy to speak a bit more specifically to your question. First and foremost, if this is, you know, in regards to, you know, being better at including Indigenous disabled people in the disability justice movement, I think it's important to, like what you're doing now, like giving Indigenous disabled folks like the platform to have our voices heard and acknowledged and recognized, and giving us the spaces to do that. I've noticed a lot of disability activism at the forefront is mainly white disabled people, and we need to give more space in leadership in disability activism and disability justice to disabled people of color, but in particular Indigenous disabled people in the context of Canada, or even in general. And I think in addition to this, you know, when our voices aren't being heard or aren't being respected, then to support us, you know, alongside us being on the sideline when we do need it, but also giving us the space to have our own voices heard, because our voices are just as important and our experiences are just as important. And I think, you know, even if you're not disabled and, you know, you want to get more involved in allyship, I think ultimately, like I've kind of mentioned or I've reiterated a lot that like Indigenous sovereignty is ultimately connected to Indigenous sovereignty is ultimately connected to disability justice. If you're for truth and reconciliation, if you are for land back, if you're for, you know, all these Indigenous movements that are happening and you're for supporting Indigenous people, then you need to be involved as an ally in the disability justice movement. And even like small things like, you know, educating people that you know in your life about disability issues and about Indigenous issues, and sharing, you know, even sharing stuff on social media or going to protests and being there to support us in numbers is just a couple of small examples that people can be allies to our fight and our causes.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I find that, you know, the word disability, like it to someone who is able-bodied or to someone who is white, it's sort of like a group all sort of fight. But realistically, like there's levels to it, right? Like there's a generational trauma that has come from, you know, residential schools, that's just come from colonization. And, you know, there's just differences in diagnoses, there's differences in healthcare, there's differences in traditional medicine versus Western medicine. So I find that if we were to just sort of understand that, you know, there's levels and not everyone who is not able-bodied is the same sort of caliber. There's like, you know, it's more accountability to no matter where you are on that spectrum to understand that there's differences. We're almost out of time. Exactly. But if you're willing to stay a bit longer, I wanted to sort of just briefly touch base on the bill C7 that is sort of on the forefront of policy changes that are happening, that is going to be like a direct, you know, sort of attack or threat to people of color with disabilities in our country. If people aren't aware of it, Bill C7 is an amendment of Bill C14, which basically accounts for medically assisted death. So basically what that is that, you know, if you are having a foreseeable death or due to your disability or like reasonable chance of like, you know, mortality, then you can request MAID and they could, you know, medically put you, you know, to die. But with the amendment that's coming right now is they are changing it so that people who don't have death in the foreseeable future can apply for MAID. This has caused like a lot of polarized opinions in the disability community and just in the able-bodied community of Canada, sort of using the cloak of dying with dignity. But based on that, the policies haven't been talked to the Indigenous communities of Canada or the POC communities of Canada. And, you know, there are so many ways to handle and help people with disabilities. But I find that the government is just sort of having the option for death. And how do you think that affects you, like hearing that this might be coming to light?
I'm scared. I'm scared. I'm really scared, not just for myself, but for so many people in, you know, my local Indigenous community and for Indigenous communities across Canada. This is like legalized state-sanctioned murder. It just, you know, it just feels like residential schools all over again, except, you know, it's literal genocide, because they're saying that, oh, well, you know, we just assume that disabled people think that their lives don't have any value or worth, and we don't think their life has any value and worth, and it's just easier to give them the option to die rather than to improve the quality of life of disabled people and BIPOC disabled people or disabled people of color in particular, by, you know, raising social assistance rates and addressing all the factors that cause disabled people of color in particular to have, you know, such a low quality of life and want to consider MAID as an option because it just feels like there's no way out.
Yeah. Precisely. Like, honestly, for like me personally, I've grown up with disability myself, but my sister has been deemed like a more serious disability. And she has lung disease and lupus and an autoimmune disorder. And she was offered MAID 5 years ago before this change was made. So it's something that I think about a lot. So the fact that, like, you know, she's someone who has a chronic illness, probably not going to get better from it. It's already offered to her. And now they are opening the grounds for people who aren't even on the same sort of caliber in disability. So it worries me, honestly. And, you know, what are some ways that you are going to educate people on this, or, you know, what does this conversation
Yeah, to elaborate, I guess, a bit upon your point is that the reason why, you know, aside from our, you know, especially I can speak towards, you know, people who are chronically ill because I have an autoimmune disorder. You know, obviously part of our pain and suffering is from the conditions themselves because they're incurable and deteriorate us over time. But the majority of it, and experience as well, and the reason why chronically ill people have so many mental health concerns too, is because of the ways in which, like, is that there are other forms of oppression that are ultimately impacting why we would consider choosing MAID as an option. Sometimes, yes, it can be from a severe illness alone, but often a lot of times it's because, you know, we're living with not enough resources and support, and we're living in poverty, and we can't work, and ODSP isn't enough, and rent is too high, and we can't afford food, and we're just basically trying to survive. And sometimes, you know, MAID could feel like just like the better way out because you lose hope. You just don't think things are going to get better. It's hard to live day by day. And I guess to answer the second part of your question, yeah, so I was saying that it's mostly just the conditions of society that create oppression and, you know, make it harder for disabled people to want to keep living in the first place. And if we were just to fix those systems, we wouldn't have to have a bill like made. In terms of how, you know, I'm educating people, I'm just, you know, even just on Twitter, things like that, like I've been sharing a lot about MAID and talking about like, hey, so this is a thing, and this is why it's a problem, and you should contact, you know, your MPP or sorry, your MP, because it's at the national level. So like contact your MP about like why you're not, you know, you're against this bill, and like, and I know that DJNO is doing some work to advocate, you know, for disabled people around MAID as well, and I'll also be involved in that. So there's many ways we can advocate, whether you're disabled or not, to the federal government and to Senate to ensure that this bill isn't brought into legislation.
Great. Just like a little bit of context, just they were supposed to, like the Senate, sorry, was supposed to conclude on the bill today. But because so many people are speaking out and so many people are, you know, talking about how this is basically euthanasia, you know, this is legalized murder. And we all know that this is going to be targeted to Indigenous and POCs of Canada. So one thing that they're doing is they're holding off the meeting till February 26th. So if anyone could, you know, email your MP, you can email a senator, you can, you know, get your voice out, probably even sign up to speak during the hearing because it's open to the public. So I encourage everyone to do that. And I appreciate that you yourself are bringing awareness to that, because I feel like it's extremely necessary. This is like a direct threat. So we need to, you know, on the grounds of advocating and fostering the community that, you know, helps with disability justice. This is like a prime example of things that, you know, you should do and we should all do.
Yeah, if you want to be an ally, now is the time to set up 100%. This is about life or death for us.
Yeah. So because we're a little bit over, I do want to thank you, River, for being here with me and having this conversation and being here with everyone else that's listening. I do appreciate you a lot, and it's been an absolute pleasure hearing your story and hearing all the stuff that you have to say and educating me and everyone about, you know, disability justice and Indigenous sovereignty. Very much appreciate it, and I would like you to continue your work and yeah, just keep being awesome.
Thank you so much for having me and providing this space, and for everybody coming. It means so much to hear that people are, you know, care about Indigenous sovereignty in relation to disability justice and care about Indigenous disabled people, because we're often the ones that are left behind.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. You got some thank yous in the comments, so you can read them if you wish.
Oh. Let's see. Thank you, Chimakwach, everybody.
All right, awesome. Okay, good night, everyone, and thank you, River, once again. We'll keep in touch, and I hope to have more of these conversations soon in the upcoming future, probably around January, February, maybe, but I'll keep you updated.
I would love to be a part of that again. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Okay,
thank you. Good night, everyone. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.
Okay, bye.